One common tactic I've noticed some writers use is to have a fairly light, happy start to the story, wait until the readers get attached to the characters, and then take things to a much darker and more complex place. This is great for grabbing the reader's attention and creating deeper stories, but I find there are often problems with how it's executed. It can be very easy to make things just a bit too complicated and hard to follow, or to badly pace the transition from light to dark. Today I'll be talking about a story that I think did this transition perfectly, one that goes from light to dark and simple to complex seamlessly and without any confusion. Ladies and gentlemen, may I introduce Mondaiji-tachi ga isekai kara kuru soudesu yo, also known as The Problem Children Are Coming From Another World, aren't they? Mondaiji starts when our three protagonists are summoned from Earth to a magical world to play games. They end up supporting a beleaguered group through playing these games, and we have a fanservice big-breasted nobility character cheering them on. So far, this may seem just a bit like another fantasy novel, but Mondaiji does actually have a fairly unique story. You see, the gift games of Mondaiji aren't exactly like chess or poker or even magical versions of those games, but rather something far more akin to the 12 Tasks of Hercules. These games can include anything from being asked to try and ride a griffin bareback around some mountains, to beating Jack the Ripper in a duel, to making a flower bloom within a day. The world of Mondaiji is called Little Garden, a dimension that is connected to all the alternate timelines of Earth, and is positively crawling with gods and demons from any religion or mythos you can think of. Creatures of all different species band together to form communities, and there's a complex system of alliances and competition between these communities through gift games. Also, there are these little things roaming around the land called demon lords, who enforce communities into games and enjoy nothing more than snacking on them. Nom nom nom. The three protagonists of this story are called Problem Children, but it would honestly be just as easy to call them superheroes or demigods instead. We have Asuka, a dignified young lady who has mind control powers, which can also somehow be used to supercharge magical weapons. Yo, an introverted tomboy who can use and combine the abilities of any non-human entity she touches. And Izayoi, a lackadaisical smartass who has superhuman strength and is almost invincible, though not quite. Interestingly, they all had their powers before they came to Little Garden, and pretty much just agreed to be summoned because they were feeling bored, which should give you just a bit of insight into their character. Unlike the title would imply, they're not really troublemakers so much as all just having a rules and consequences be damned type attitude. Rather refreshingly for a story that has a fairly large emphasis on fighting, our main characters are all actually quite intelligent and generally well-rounded, though admittedly their tempers have a slightly shorter than average fuse. Other than the three main characters, there are only two others that have enough time devoted to them to be worth mentioning. One is Jin, the 11-year-old leader of the community that summoned our protagonists. He has all the presence of a wet towel and is pretty useless at the beginning of the story. He does manage to grow a spine as the series progresses though, and actually begins to transfer from being annoying to being somewhat likable. The other one is the oddly named Kuro Usagi, or Black Rabbit. I say oddly named because she is very distinctly not black, and it would be much more appropriate to call her Blue Rabbit, or possibly Pink Rabbit if she's pissed. Anyways, aside from name ramblings, Kuro Usagi acts as a sort of mother figure to the group, and also unfortunately as a source of fan service. Mondaiji has an awesome setting, with the world of Little Garden being very well fleshed out by the author. It not only has an excellent description of the locales, to the point where I can easily visualize any area the protagonists have visited, but also a detailed backstory and history of the regions. It makes it so that you are not only invested in the characters of Mondaiji, but also the world itself. The fact that Little Garden is tied into all different timelines of Earth also helps. Each of the protagonists come from a different timeline on Earth, and seeing how what happened in one character's timeline affected the timeline of another character who's from the future is really quite interesting. Another thing I have to give the author props for is the sheer quantity of mythology he's managed to weave into the story. The world draws on Celtic, Norse, Greek, Buddhist, Hindu, Taoist, Zoroastrian mythologies, as well as Arthurian legends, and I'm sure there's even more that I'm just forgetting. I consider myself to be reasonably knowledgeable on mythology, but I still found myself running to Wikipedia to look up various deities and heroes that I'd never heard of before. Lastly, as I mentioned in the intro, I really like how this story manages its transitions from a fairly upbeat start to something much more serious as it goes on. There's no real, well shit, things just got dark moment, but more of a dawning realization in the story that, wow, things are actually getting way more serious than they were at the start. When did that happen? As far as I'm concerned, if a story can do that transition without the reader noticing, then it's doing a good job. I have two gripes with this story. First, the rule sets for the gift games, while often fairly straightforward, occasionally make very little sense. The problem is that how one arrives at a set of rules appears to be very arbitrary if the game maker is a demon lord, and most baddies just so happen to be demon lords. See, when a demon lord makes a game, both sides don't have to agree to it since the demon lords can force others into games, and this eliminates any incentive to actually have fair rules. This then raises the question, why don't demon lords just create games that are completely unwinnable? As an example, in one game, all the male participants had their endurance reduced by half as one of the rules set by the Demon Lord host. If it could do that, why not just completely eliminate the endurance of all participants other than the host? It's also possible to draw up a set of rules for a game and then force someone else unwillingly to be the host for the game, and this actually happens within the story. It would be nice to know why the villains of the story don't just abuse the heck out of that ability and make allies fight each other until the end of time. Given that the majority of the story revolves around competing within these games, it would be really useful if the author could come out with a very clear explanation of what rules govern the setting of rules in the games. The other complaint I have is with the author's use of flashbacks and filler content. There are several complaints I have about this, like the author reusing the exact same text from the start of the first volume again in the third volume, but by far my biggest just has to do with where he chose to place it. At one point, our heroes are engaged in an epic battle. One of our heroes is just on the verge of death. And then we get several chapters of flashback filler. I mean, I think I wouldn't have minded it as much if it was actually interesting and character building, and we do actually get that at some points in the story. But in this case, it was things like a tea gathering and Lily's big adventure. Really? It just feels like the author decided he wanted to torture the reader a bit before returning to relevant content. So I quite enjoyed Mondaiji, and generally I'd recommend it to any fantasy fans out there. It's got a fascinating world, likable characters, and its pacing most of the time is quite decent. I just really wish some aspects of the gift game were a bit better explained. If you've already read Mondaiji and are looking for something else to read, I'd recommend No Game No Life, because as I already mentioned, some parts of that story are quite similar. Anyways, thanks for listening to my review. Cheers!